During Lent, the parish sponsored a series of facilitated meetings about the 94 recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. For most people in the group that I attended, this was the first time they learned about the history of our Indigenous peoples and government policies that imposed restrictions on them and removed their freedoms. It was also the first opportunity many of them had to talk about our church's role in residential schools. They weren't alone in not knowing this history. According to a report in the Toronto Star, before the remains of 215 Indigenous children were found last year, 2/3 of Canadians said they knew little or nothing about the history of our residential school system. There is no good answer as to why we didn't know. We just didn't. But slowly that's changing, and we're all taking different journeys toward learning and understanding. When Father Murray asked me to deliver this homily, I hesitated, because I am not a member of an Indigenous nation, and I am not an expert on government or church relations with Indigenous nations. I have, however, been on my own journey for a while now, and he asked that I tell you a bit about it and how I have dealt with being a Canadian and a Catholic, knowing what I now know. I'm going to warn you, a lot of what I learned caused me pain, and you might find it disturbing as well. But unless we learn, we can't act. So in 2008, I got a contract with what was then the Ontario Ministry of Aboriginal Affairs. They had compiled content on Aboriginal treaty rights and duty to consult and wanted me to develop a training program for them around their content so they could educate provincial employees who worked with Indigenous peoples about our obligations. To develop the training program, I had to learn their content. I learned about the multiple treaties we established, changed, and then broke. I learned about policies of our government that were, in their words, to get rid of the Indian problem. I learned that residential schools were created to separate Indigenous children from their families and communities and to systematically strip away their traditions, cultural practices, and languages. And I learned about the 60s scoop, which was the mass removal of Aboriginal children from their families into the child welfare system and ultimately into white middle-class families. I'm going to be honest, reading about all of this was tough. But it got tougher because some things happened that put faces and real people behind what I was reading. I want to go back to that contract in 2008. I hired an elder from one of the First Nations to work with me on my project, and over the course of the time that we worked together, he told me about his life. I knew a bit about the 60s scoop from my readings, but when he told me about his personal experience, it became real. He had a difficult personal history. His parents had suffered as a result of their time in residential schools, and 2 of his siblings died in the streets. He and one other brother managed to get past those traumas because they lived with their kokum, their grandmother. He told me the reason he was never taken was that every time the government planes, they were yellow, were seen in the sky coming to their community, his grandmother would go to the door and yell to them, "They're coming! Run for the bush!" And he and his brother, both very young children, would run and they would hide. They would hide in the bush all day and sometimes until the next day when the yellow plane would take off and leave with the children they did manage to round up. That was the day my heart broke. But as much as my heart was broken, I must admit that I saw it as something that didn't belong to me. I didn't do it. People I don't know did it a long time ago, and so I didn't think I had the ability to do anything about it. And then I read Isabel Wilkerson's book, Caste. Her analogy of our country and the shape it is in being like an old house we inherit from a great aunt was empowering. This is what she said. She said, America, I'm going to put Canada. Canada is an old house. We can never declare the work over. When you live in an old house, you may not want to go into the basement after a storm to see what the rains have wrought. Choose not to look, however, at your own peril. The owner of an old house knows that whatever you are ignoring will never go away. Whatever is lurking will fester, whether you choose to look or not. Ignorance is no protection from the consequences of inaction. Whatever you are wishing will gnaw at you until you gather the courage to face what you would rather not see. We in the developed world are like homeowners who inherited a house on a piece of land that is beautiful on the outside, but whose soil is unstable loam and rock, heaving and contracting over generations, cracks patched, but the deeper ruptures waved away for decades, centuries even. Many people will rightly say, I had nothing to do with how all this started. I have nothing to do with the sins of the past. My ancestors never attacked Indigenous people, never owned slaves. And yes, not one of us was here when this house was built. Our immediate ancestors may have had nothing to do with it. But here we are, the current occupants of a property with stress cracks and bowed walls and fissures built into the foundation. We are the heirs to whatever is right or wrong with it. We did not erect the uneven pillars or joists, but they are ours to deal with now. And any further deterioration is, in fact, in our hands. Oh my gosh, I read that and I saw a path forward. I may not be able to change the mind of policymakers in Ottawa or the Council of Bishops, but just like patching a crack in the plaster of an old house is a small but significant step in repairing it, I decided that I can do small things that might have an impact on my own soul and on the people around me. So I've been continuing to read, and I sit in on workshops and webinars, and then I share what I learn with others. You may have noticed a couple of pieces I wrote for our parish bulletin this summer. They weren't earth-shattering, but hopefully when you enjoyed the Three Sisters soup at the recent open house, you understood why it was called Three Sisters. I'm also the chair of the Board of Trustees at St. Mary's Hospital, and last year I introduced a year of learning about diversity and inclusion with our board and introduced a land acknowledgement that now begins all of our meetings. Neither of these are big either, but they are little things that I can do. And what about our church? There is no question that the recent visit by the Pope was powerful. Was it what everyone wanted? Maybe not. But he came, he owned what was done, and he apologized. It was his first step. And the same can be said of the actions of the Canadian Council of Bishops. And what about our parish? We can't change the history of our church's role in residential schools, but we can acknowledge it and do so each Mass in our petitions. Father Murray placed the vests he received while working in one of the Cree communities in the sanctuary, so we have a physical reminder of the relationship we have with Indigenous peoples. He also repeats the penitential prayer in Cree, so that we not only see a reminder of that relationship, but we also hear it. The parish sponsored the series of workshops I told you about. We have an Indigenous garden outside our front entrance. What we're doing isn't big, but they're steps. The relationship with our Indigenous peoples was broken hundreds of years ago and formed the basis for this old house that we have inherited. What keeps me in it? The cracks that we slowly but collectively are repairing, one step at a time.